users can now register and then log in to get a JWT access token to authenticate with other servers. But what's going to happen when that access token expires, which we have set to expire in 30 minutes? Well, the user's going to have to log in, enter their username and password. It's going to be a pain. So what we need to do is introduce refresh tokens so that when the access token expires, the user can send a refresh token to our authentication server and get back a new access token. And if this is implemented correctly on the client side, it's going to be a pretty seamless experience. So let's get an expired JWT access token so that we can test this out. So I'm going to change my expiration minutes to 15 seconds, 0.25, and I also need to update my authentication configuration because I took an integer and we now have a double. So I log in, get my access token, let's get that real quick. We only got 15 seconds, paste that in here, and first request, we get OK, so we did authenticate. And now after waiting a little bit, sending the request again, and it still says OK. So why is that? Well, if we go into our data server and look at our token validation parameters, one thing we need to add is a ClockSkew of timespan.0. So by default, I think the ClockSkew is like 5 minutes. So that means if your token expired 4 minutes ago, it's still going to accept it because the token expiration is within that 5-minute ClockSkew. So we're going to set that to 0 so that when the token expires, it is truly expired. We get OK the first time. I'll wait a little bit. And there we go. Now we get unauthorized. And the only way to re-authenticate would be to hit the login route on our authentication server again with our credentials, get a new access token, and pass it to the data server. So instead of that, it is now refresh token time. So the first thing we need to do is actually generate a refresh token and give it back to the user. And we're going to do that when they log in. So our authenticated user response, we are going to add a property for the refresh token. So just going to be a string again, same thing as the access token. And now we need to actually generate a refresh token up here for our user. So we could use the access token generator if we take a look at that. Except the reason I don't want to do that is because we really do not need to sign these claims into our refresh token. I'd also like to use a different secret key instead of the access token secret, so that if the access token secret got stolen, all of my access tokens and refresh tokens wouldn't become invalid when I change the secret. And I would also like to use a much longer expiration minutes here, preferably about a few months. So instead of the access token generator, we're going to create our own refresh token generator, so just a class for that. And similar to the access token generator, we're going to have a method to generate a token. And obviously we're going to be generating a JWT. The only difference is the claims are going to be different, and in fact, on our refresh token, we're not going to have any additional claims. So for our refresh token generator, we're going to have to get sign-in credentials again, construct a JWT security token, and then write the token. So we are going to reuse all of this, and just to demonstrate this a little bit better, let's move the claims up here. So basically, everything right here is going to be reused in our refresh token generator. So I could just duplicate all of this, copy and paste it into my refresh token generator, but I feel like we have a really great opportunity here to move this into its own class. So I'm going to create a new class here for a token generator. And this will also have a method to generate a token. And it's going to hold all of this logic that we want to share between our access token generator and our refresh token generator. So let's just cut that out, move that into here, import all this stuff, and then we're going to get all of these configuration values from our method parameters so that the access token generator and the refresh token generator can pass in different values for things like the secret key, the expiration minutes, and the claims, which is important because they are going to have different values. So let's move these into parameters. So we'll have a secret key, we can just generate that, the issuer and the audience, the expiration minutes, and last but not least, the claims. And I'm putting these last because I want them to be nullable because my refresh token generator isn't actually going to pass in any claims. And one thing to note is that the JWT security token does accept null claims. So let's start using this little helper class we have here. So we'll get that through the constructor. So now we have our token generator, and now all we have to do is use that token generator and generate a token and pass in all of our values. So we got the access token secret, the issuer, the audience, all coming from our configuration object, and then we just pass in our claims as well. So same thing, just less duplication, and before we forget, we should register this with our services. So the token generator, and while we're here, we can also add the refresh token generator as well. And speaking of that refresh token generator, let's head back there, and this is going to need our authentication configuration. And of course, it's also going to need our token generator as well. And obviously, we are going to inject those through the constructor. And this is going to be very simple to implement, so I'm actually just going to copy the return statement in our access token generator, paste that in our refresh token generator, and the only difference is that we don't have any claims. And we're also going to need a refresh token secret and a refresh token expiration minutes as well. So let's generate these properties on our authentication configuration. There we go, here's our new properties, and now all we have to do is add those to our app settings.json. So we'll have a refresh token secret and the refresh token expiration minutes. I gotta do some math. I think I want this to be like 3 months maybe. Alright, here we go. 131,400 minutes. I didn't do the math, I just typed it into Google. And now we need to update our refresh token secret because it's the same as our access token secret. So you could generate a new value using the website that I showed off last episode. But just to keep this demo moving, I'm just going to change this first character to a 3 instead of a 4, just so that the secrets are different. And now we are ready to use our refresh token generator. So let's go into our authentication controller and let's inject that. So we'll have that in a field, a refresh token generator. Add that to the constructor, and we already have that registered in our startup.cs, so now we can go ahead and use it, generate a token, and we're not passing in the user because we're not adding any user claims to the token. But now we have our refresh token, and now we can just send that back to the user. Yay! So now when we log in, as you can see, we get our refresh token. Let's put that in the debugger, JWT.io, and here we go, here's our payload. So really all we added was the expiration, the issuer, and the audience, and our not before is just the default right now. So no additional claims, and we'll see why that's okay in just a second. So we have our refresh token. Now what the heck do we do with it? How are we going to use this to get a new access token? So we're going to need a new route for that. So let's go into our authentication controller, and this is going to be a post request to the refresh route. So let's make a method to handle that. We'll call it refresh, and the user is going to have to send that refresh token in the body of the HTTP request. So we'll create an object for that, a refresh request, and we'll create that in our request folder over here in our models. And all we're going to get in this request is the refresh token. And might as well add some data annotations, so this is going to be required. So since we have data annotations, we're going to start off by validating our model state. So I'll just copy this and paste it down here. So the very first thing I want to do is validate this refresh token. Make sure it's not expired, validate the signing key. So I'm going to create a new folder in my services for token validators, and we're going to have a refresh token validator, and we'll just have a single method on here to validate a refresh token, and that's going to return true or false for if the refresh token is valid. So validating JWTs in .NET really isn't that hard. All we have to do is create a JWT security token handler. So we'll just instantiate one of those, and all we have to do is use token handler and validate a token. So we can pass in the string representing our token. That's going to be a refresh token. And then we're going to need token validation parameters. We'll get those in a second. And it's also going to output a security token that represents the validated token, which we're actually not going to use, but we do have to specify the output parameter. And this method also returns a claims principal. So it decodes the JWT, which might be useful if you have information signed into those claims, such as what we have in our access token. But in this case, we are not going to be using those claims. And as you can see, it throws a bunch of exceptions. So if the signature is invalid, if it's expired, it's going to throw an exception. So that said, we're going to surround this in a try catch. And if we get an exception, then we're just going to return false because our token is not valid. But otherwise, we're going to return true. So we need token validation parameters. Let's get a variable for those. We'll generate that variable up here. We can move this out of the try catch. Let's do that. Now token validation parameters sounds familiar, doesn't it? And that's because in our data server, we actually use token validation parameters to configure our JWT authentication. So what I'm going to do is just copy these, and then we can use that in our validator. And we don't have an authentication configuration right here, but we can inject one through our constructor. I'm just going to call it configuration actually. So rename all this. And now instead of the access token secret, we're going to use our refresh token secret. And now we can use this to validate our refresh token. So let's go into our startup.cs. We're going to have to register this. So the refresh token validator. And now we can inject that into our authentication controller. Get it through the constructor. And now we can finally validate our refresh token. So we will use our refresh token validator, validate the refresh token on our refresh request, and if the token is not valid, then we're going to return bad request, and we'll say, oh, we got to make a new error response. Got to stay consistent with those error objects, and we'll just say invalid refresh token. Of course, we could change this validate method so that it would tell us if the token was expired or the signature was invalid, but this is good enough for now. We're just going to figure out if it's invalid. So we've made it this far. We now have a valid refresh token, but we have an issue. Who is the user? Who sent this refresh request? And how are we going to generate a new access token for them if we don't know who it is? So there's really two solutions to this. We could sign the user's ID into the refresh token and then get that ID when we validate the refresh token, but I actually don't want to do that because this refresh token is powerful. If the refresh token gets stolen, then the person that stole the refresh token is going to be able to constantly refresh, get new credentials, and we would have no way to invalidate this refresh token unless we changed the signing key. And that's kind of our main goal. We don't want to be changing the signing key because that's going to invalidate every single refresh token. So what could we do to invalidate a refresh token without changing the refresh token secret key? We could store the refresh token in something like a database, for example, which we'll implement later. And then if the refresh token doesn't exist in our authentication server storage or database, then the token is not valid. So that said, if a refresh token gets stolen, to invalidate the token, we wouldn't have to change our secret key. We would just simply remove it from our storage or our database, and then that refresh token couldn't be used by some kind of imposter to keep getting a new access token. And if we're going to be storing the refresh token in the database to validate it, then we can also store that refresh token along with the ID of the user that owns that refresh token. And if we have that user ID, then we can query for that user by ID, and then in this refresh method we can finally generate a new access token for that user. So in our services, we're going to have a refresh token repository. Let's create a folder for those refresh token repositories, and we're going to interface this because we're going to implement this using a database later. So we're going to have the refresh token repository, and the first thing we need is a way to create or save a refresh token. So we'll have a create method on here. So we're not just going to have a string for the refresh token here because we want to store the user's ID along with the refresh token. So we're going to create an object to hold all that, and I'm just going to call it refresh token. So it's going to be like a DTO, and we're going to create that in our models folder. So a class for a refresh token, and we're going to have a string for the refresh token that we're storing. We mentioned we want the user ID. That's a GUID. And I actually can't call this refresh token because that's the name of the class. So we'll just call it token. And then we'll also give this a unique identifier as well. And now let's use that in this repository. And let's actually implement this interface. So same thing we did for the user repository. We're just going to have an in-memory refresh token repository. Implement that interface. We'll have a list up here to store all of these refresh tokens that we create. Just instantiate that up here, refresh tokens. And now this create method, it's also going to give the refresh token its unique identifier, and then we'll add that refresh token to our list of refresh tokens. And we made this a task because we're going to implement it asynchronously when we have a database. So all we can do here is just return task completed task, just to satisfy this return type. And let's register this in dependency injection. So an refresh token repository as the in-memory refresh token repository. Going to have to inject that in our controller. So now when we log in and we generate that refresh token, we're going to have to store it in our refresh token repository. So let's create that DTO for the refresh token, set up all of these properties. So we got our refresh token right here, and the user ID, we have our user that we retrieved from the login, and now just use that refresh token repository and create the refresh token DTO, and that'll save it in the repository. And now that it's saved, when we refresh, we're going to need a way to query that refresh token DTO. And the only way we can query that is using the refresh token that we get in our refresh request. So on our repository, we're going to have a method to get a refresh token, and we're going to query this refresh token using the actual refresh token string. So we'll call this getByToken, and we'll pass it the refresh token. Let's go ahead and implement that. So we can use first or default on our list and get the first refresh token that has a matching token value, and we'll just return that. We have to use from result so that we can satisfy this task return type, and there we go. Now we can query for the token. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll get a refresh token DTO, use getByToken, pass in the token from our refresh request, and now this could return null if the refresh token didn't exist in our list. So we're going to have to check for that. And if it was null, we're going to send another bad request for an invalid refresh token. Although actually, if it wasn't found, maybe we should do a not found. I feel like it could go either way. It's always a little bit tricky with authentication because a lot of times you really don't want to give too much information. But now we have our refresh token DTO, and on this DTO we have the user ID. So now we can query for this user by ID and generate new tokens for them. So to get that user by ID, we're going to use our user repository, and we do not have a get by ID method. So I'm going to have to create one of those, but we are going to pass in the user ID, and we'll put that into a variable. It's going to be async. Let's generate that method. Nice, so it got the signature right for us, and let's implement that before we forget. So we can just copy one of these other methods and change this to ID and user ID. So now back in our controller, this user could also be null. So if the user's null, then we're going to return, we'll go for another not found here, and we'll say user not found this time as the error message. But now if we're past this, we have a user, the refresh token was valid, so now we can finally generate new tokens for them. And this is actually going to be very similar to how we generated tokens up here. So we generated an access token for a user, then a refresh token, save the refresh token, and give back this authenticated user response. So instead of just duplicating all this, what I'm going to do is create a class that does all of this for me. So in my services, I'll have a new folder here. We'll call this authenticators, and we'll create a class called an authenticator. It took me a while to come up with this name because I needed something kind of generic, and we'll just have a single method on here. It's going to give us back that authenticated user response. And I don't really love getting back a response object from this class. Ideally, I would have like an authenticated user and then map authenticated user to the response object, but just keeping it simple, and we'll call this method authenticate, and it's going to take in the user that we want to authenticate. So let's go ahead and cut all this out, paste it in here, and we're not going to be returning OK because we're not in a controller, and we're going to have to inject all of these services through the constructor. So let's create fields for all those. There we go, and then generate that constructor. And since we're injecting things, let's go ahead and register that in our startup.cs, the authenticator. And now we're ready to use this. And since we're going to be using our authenticator, we're going to inject that. And that authenticator is going to take care of the access token and refresh token generation, so we don't actually need those classes in our controller. So that's nice, kind of getting rid of those low-level dependencies. And I'm just going to completely regenerate this constructor now. And let's use that authenticator, so that gives us an authenticated user response by authenticating our user. And then we can just return OK with that response. And for the refresh method, same thing. So we can just copy these simple 2 lines of code, paste those down there. And now we're successfully taking the user's refresh token, validating the token, and then generating new tokens for that user. So now I log in, I give my access token. Let's do this real quick. And then I authenticate with my data server. There we go, we get an OK. But then finally, the token expires, so now I need to use my refresh token to get a new access token. So let's duplicate this tab, go to the refresh route, and then for our body we need a refresh token, which we got right here. And let's send this request. There we go, we get new tokens. Let's grab this access token, use it on our data server, and now we are authenticated again. And now this expires, so now back on this refresh route, I can send this refresh request again and get a new access token and paste that in here, and that works. So we kind of have an issue here, and that's you can use a refresh token multiple times. And that might not be a big deal because we get a new refresh token back anyways, but I still feel like it's unnecessary and we should delete the refresh token after it's used so that's no longer valid. So what we're going to do is after we get the refresh token back from our repository, we're simply just going to delete it. So let's use our refresh token repository and delete a refresh token. And actually we can just delete by ID. So we'll just pass the ID to this delete method and let's generate this method. There we go, so it generated that correctly. And let's implement it. So we're going to have to return task, completed task, and then let's delete that refresh token. Pretty simple. Since we have a list, we can use remove all and just pass in a predicate for the refresh tokens that we want to get rid of. And we want to get rid of every refresh token with the matching ID. So now the refresh token isn't going to be able to be used multiple times. Alright, so first attempt, we used the refresh token successfully. Try again. Oh, nope, invalid refresh token now. And now I also want to show off an expired refresh token, so let's change this expiration to 15 seconds. So if I refresh this, we hit this exception when we go to validate the token, and the exception is the token is expired. So this validation does indeed work. So what if the refresh token gets stolen? Whoever steals that token is going to be able to constantly refresh over and over again, keep getting refresh tokens, keep getting access tokens, and just completely destroy the real user's life. So we already established we're not going to change the secret key because that would invalidate every single refresh token that exists. So what we need to do is give the user a way to invalidate their refresh tokens, and we're going to classify that as logging out, and we will implement that next time. But for now, we implemented refreshing capabilities, so all we did was generate a refresh token, store the refresh token in a database so that we can invalidate whenever we need to without having to change the secret key, and then we send that refresh token back to the user, and they can hit this refresh route with their refresh token. We validate the token, make sure it exists in our database, delete it once it's used, then we get the user associated with that refresh token and give them back new tokens. That's the main summary. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave them below in the comments section. But other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.